Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. The last time we had Representative Chris Pappas on the program, he was trapped in Washington, stuck voting for a new speaker. Much has happened in the meantime, and we want to get right into it with the congressman who joins us in studio today. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you as well, Mr.
Good morning, Adam. Good to see you.
Yeah. So people of a certain age out there may have no idea what TikTok is, but they understand that, freedom of association and freedom of expression are keystone values of this country. So how do you explain in basic terms why it's a good idea to ban the app TikTok?
Well, TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a company that's owned in China and has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And there are serious national security concerns about Chinese influence over an app that 170 million Americans are estimated to utilize. So both in terms of the data and how that could potentially be seized and used by China and weaponized against us, and the algorithm. And if China, sought to influence the company in a certain way, they could push messages to the American public that could be really destabilizing for our country. So we've heard from the national security experts on this, and this is a bill that doesn't outright ban it. It forces a sale of TikTok from its parent company to a company that would be located in a non-adversarial country. It was something that got more than 350 members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, to support it. So our concerns are based in national security and how the app could potentially be used against us by the Chinese Communist Party, and we're hoping and expecting that it would be sold if the bill is passed into law.
Some opponents would say, they make the slippery slope argument. What's next? There are a lot of apps out there that have Chinese Communist Party influence in them. Do you start targeting those next?
Well, I think this one, given its utilization and given the vulnerabilities, is something that we're looking closely at. And you've seen states like New Hampshire ban the app on government phones. The federal government has taken those steps too. So I think it's really important to think about the vulnerabilities that exist with this app. And again, this is not seeking to ban it. It's seeking to get it sold and have it divested from ByteDance. And I expect that's exactly what would happen.
While we're on a tech subject, let's talk about something that's very important, doesn't get a lot of discussion often. That's artificial intelligence. It's possible in the next term of Congress we're going to see even more progress on this front, leaps and bounds. It could be even more disruptive to the economy, the social fabric, all of those things. Does Congress need to step in to provide some sort of guardrails for AI?
Absolutely. And I'm not on some of the committees of jurisdiction here, but I'm also on committees, including the Veterans Committee, where there are some potential benefits to AI in helping to deliver care and providing good benefits to our veteran population, for instance. So we've got to make sure that we're understanding the possibilities that exist with AI, but are guarding against the abuses that could exist and the destructive nature that could come about if we are not careful. So I know there are committees that are really focused on this. We also have to ensure that the technology, whether it's AI, quantum computing, continues to be developed here in the United States so that we have ultimate control over this and that it's not that we're not being outpaced by China in particular.
Let's turn to the immigration issue. When Democrats accuse Republicans of, quote, fear-mongering by highlighting the case of this young woman in Georgia, Laken Riley, who was abducted and murdered allegedly by an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela, are they missing the more fundamental point of why so many people are angry about what's happening?
Well, the death of that young woman, the murder of that young woman, is an absolute tragedy. It shouldn't have happened, and that individual needs to be held to account and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And it's one of the reasons why I continue to push the administration to come up with better plans for how we create some order on the southern border, and why I'm pushing my colleagues in Congress, including the Speaker of the House, to bring legislation to the floor that will allow us to fix this problem. Now, this isn't a problem that just arose overnight. We've had an immigration problem and security issues on the border for decades and decades, and we've seen the consequences of that in this country. And so it's really important that Republicans and Democrats come together and find the tools that will actually help us address this. There are some that just want to continue to allow this to be used as a political football. I'm in the camp of trying to fix this and solve the problem. That's why I'm supporting bipartisan legislation that was developed in the Senate between a very conservative senator and more liberal Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who worked through this on asylum reforms and funding that is needed. When you think about the issue like fentanyl, and we know we see the devastating impacts of that here in New Hampshire, we've got to make sure we have the technology at border checkpoints. We've heard from Customs and Border Patrol that they've got new technology that can help them better identify fentanyl as it comes through ports of entry, which is where 95% of it comes through, but they don't have the funding to deploy it. And that is unacceptable. So we've got to make sure that there is funding, that there are resources, more Border Patrol agents, intelligence, that we're fixing the broken asylum system. No one should be going, several years without getting their case heard. We need to be able to adjudicate that quickly and provide resources to our communities in affected areas that are dealing with the consequences of a broken border.
Do you agree with President Biden's decision to expand his use of parole authority on immigration to allow more immigrants from certain countries, including Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, to fly into the United States? The figures show that under this particular program, 327,000 people entered the country last year.
Well, there are some cases, given the humanitarian crises we see around the world, where that may be appropriate. But I think that we've got to be smart about how we work with partner nations around the world to not have so much pressure on our borders and entry points into the United States, which has resulted in the situation that we see today. So as we think about asylum, for instance, we should be allowing people to apply for asylum from their home nation without having to pay off the cartels and coyotes to get them here to the border, which creates an incredibly unsafe situation for these migrants. So I think we've got to be smart about it. And we just can't have unlimited immigration into this country. We need to have limits. We need to have an orderly system. And that's one of the reasons why we need fixes in terms of our legal immigration system, so that it ultimately supports the needs of our economy, but also allows the United States to continue to have, to be a beacon to the rest of the world in terms of folks that want to come here, work hard, achieve their American dream.
But if Congress can't do that anytime soon, do you support the president taking executive action to solve the issues?
Well, I think the president needs to look at the authorities that he has right now, but I don't believe those are adequate to solve the problem alone. Congress needs to act, and that's why we need the Speaker to allow members to take votes and ultimately be able to fix this. We can't do that if Donald Trump and Mike Johnson are preventing legislation that's common sense from coming to the floor.
One last question on immigration. Do you believe the state money that's being spent at the northern border in New Hampshire is money well spent?
Well, I think we need to understand all the vulnerabilities, and certainly our northern border is a vulnerability, and we need to be concerned about that. And so I think what I have been looking at the federal level is the way that we've seen resources diverted from the northern border to the southern border. It's appropriate to figure out how we can surge resources at the southern border, but we shouldn't take our eye off a potential vulnerability on the northern border, and we'll continue to help advocate for those resources so that New Hampshire doesn't have to do it alone.
Part of what's tied up in this immigration issue and the fact there is no vote is obviously the aid to Ukraine and the fight over that in Congress. The director of the CIA just testified before Congress that if that aid doesn't get to Ukraine in relatively short order, you could start to see major territorial gains made by Russia in their invasion. So if this gets passed this month or even later than that, is it possible it's just too late?
Well, I hope not. And we see the Ukrainians already rationing ammunition. They're counting every bullet. They don't have the systems that they need to continue to hold the line against Russia, which is advancing, which is reclaiming territory right now. So it's a very dangerous potential inflection point. And that's why the aid is so important. The administration announced $300 million worth of armaments that's going to be going to Ukraine. But that's about all the administration can do without Congress acting here. And again, this is an issue where if you put it on the floor, you'd have more than 300 members of the House voting in favor of aid to our ally to stop the Russian advance, allow them to be able to protect their civilians and achieve independence. And the United States of America, as the leading democracy in the world, we should be standing for that. We shouldn't be bowing down to Vladimir Putin. And so this aid is absolutely essential right now. I think we can get it done. We've seen more activity on the other side of the aisle, folks that are pushing the Speaker to allow us to vote on this, including members of my Problem Solvers caucus, and I'm going to continue to work across the aisle to try to find a solution here.
In Gaza, where do you draw the line between Israel acting in self-defense and perhaps going too far in potentially decimating the population there?
Well, Israel has every right to defend itself in the wake of the October 7th massacre, which killed well over 1,000 Israeli civilians. And we need to make sure the United States is providing the support for Israel so that they can pursue Hamas and destroy the terrorist network that continues to threaten their very existence. The United States also has a responsibility to address the humanitarian crisis that we see unfolding in Gaza. 2 million civilians, many of those not connected at all to what we saw on October 7th. And so the steps to create a port, to open up new avenues so that humanitarian relief can flow in is absolutely appropriate, something that I've called for. But I think the Israelis also have a greater responsibility, as they have troops in the area, to allow for those shipments to come in and to help facilitate greater relief to the people of Gaza so that the situation doesn't become even more dire. So I think at this point in time, we really need to see Hamas agreeing to this potential ceasefire that's on the table to release the hostages. We've seen more than 165 days go by now where we have over 100 hostages that are still being held. Some of those people are very sick and are in bad shape. They need to be returned to Israel. So that should be the primary objective here as we think about what needs to happen in the coming weeks. Any sort of agreement on a cessation of hostilities has to return these hostages back to Israel.
As we wrap up here real quick, do you support the effort in the next Congress, if you're reelected, to change the rules about vacating the chair, essentially to end potentially the chaos of seeing somebody trying to boot the speaker out every few weeks?
Yes. And I would support that now if it came to a vote. Would have supported it back in the fall if we had an opportunity to do it when there was a vote on Speaker McCarthy, and continue to talk with colleagues on both sides of the aisle about the need to fix this, because I think in the absence of some rules reform, you continue to empower those on the extreme right who don't represent the vast majority of the country or the vast majority of the Congress, and they get in the way of us being able to do our jobs and solve problems for the American people.
All right, Congressman Chris Pappas, we'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thanks, Adam.